In today's video, we're going to make this map in a tool called Inkarnate and then import it into Foundry VTT quickly for our D&D game. This is the Inkarnate website, and I wanted to go through some of the stuff that when I was looking around for a mapping tool appealed to me. There's a lot of mapping tools out there, there's a lot of competition. I've poked around at a couple of them, but when going through the website of Inkarnate and kind of looking at the map gallery, once you start seeing all the different styles, you realize that you can start making maps that are at different kinds of scales. I always liked the Mike Schley art in the D&D books, and I wanted to kind of keep some of that whimsical, cartoony look. But as you scroll through, you realize that some of the stamps that you get access to in Inkarnate are actually quite detailed. And you could use not just for a world map, but if you blow them up, they still look pretty good, and they're actually kind of isometric, which is exciting to me because I play D&D in isometric. So you can see here, this is like a town scale, almost an encounter scale map. Yeah, people's minis would be really small, but this is starting to look like a creative tabletop design for an actual encounter. So continue to scroll through, you can see here's a lighthouse, bridges that people can walk on, trees that are at the right level of detail for the type of art that I'm doing. And then I got to this image, and this is the one that sparked a little bit of imagination and creativity, where it's like, oh, that's neat. So it's isometric. It has kind of blending of mist layers and things that are meant to evoke some atmosphere and 3D-ness to this, but this is like an orc town on a stone butte, I don't know what you call that. Some rocks with, this is starting to get into the realm of fantasy, right? Not just yet another Tolkien Hamlet town, but something that's a little bit more inventive. Looking into it, you can bring in your own token stamps if you want to go through that, and you can mix in some of your own work. You can export the images in 2K and 4K and higher. So being able to take stuff, take it out, put it into Photoshop, that was all a possibility. So this is the tool that I decided to start trying out for the first couple chapters of my D&D game. So getting into this, once I'm here in Foundry, you can see I've already created quite a few maps here. Some of them are world maps and regional maps, and then other things are full town. This was like the first port town that they go to. And I've got the ships and the docks and things of various scale and the roads marked out. It's cartoony, right? Here's the party. They're larger than life, but I just wanted them to be able to move and navigate around the town. And I've even wired up some ambient sounds for them to run into. So there's like a pirate shanty here at the bar, and there's town market noises, and then there's water noises down here. Maybe I'll do a video on ambient noise and how I'm getting the ambient tracks there later. But right now, just focusing on the maps. This is a town map, and that was made with Inkarnate. Here's interesting, this is the coral reef fight that they just did, where I have some custom stamps in there. They were kind of grabbed from the internet and Google image search, pieces of interesting plants, and there's a bunch of monsters that they were fighting and a magical wall with token effects. But the base map for this, and I guess they're not fighting here anymore, so I can go and turn on the daylight on this one by going here and turning on daylight, so that Foundry will now transition to daylight once I click that button. And you can see that I've got this base map that was created with the lights turned on, so that when I take it into nighttime, it still looks pretty good, of a coral reef with a whole bunch of terrain for them to fight on. Pretty repetitive. This didn't take too long to make. There's one big Inkarnate token stamp right here that was really useful, but the rest is just water and rocks and various layers as I started getting used to Inkarnate. But one map that I'm actually kind of proud of, because I made it very, very quickly, almost entirely, actually this one's entirely made out of stuff that's just straight out of Inkarnate. This is the Apothecary's Windmill, which is actually a scene from the D&D Essentials kit. That's one of the box sets. It's not, it's from Dragon of Ice Spire Peak. The basic plot to this is that they have to go to this town, and they get sent on a mission to go get the apothecary from the windmill, or at least warn her of something that's going on. So, in my game, the apothecary is this turtle, and the thing that's threatening her is right here, and it's kind of hidden right now, but it's going to play a game of batting around the turtle which is in its shell, and then this manticore is very hungry, and the players have to decide: do they fight it? Do they try and feed it? Do they bribe it? Do they talk? There's maybe lots of ways to get this hungry manticore off of this turtle, and they're meant to be a little inventive and creative here. So this is this interesting scene because the manticore is significantly too powerful for a first level party of heroes. It is definitely going to kill some of the players if they fight it. So they have to find some creative way to deal with a monster that doesn't necessarily start out as hostile. Or they can just, maybe if there's enough PCs in the party, you really can kill it, but it's very dangerous. So I wanted to go through a tutorial here of how I made this map in Inkarnate so that people could see whether or not that type of work would be interesting to them. When making a map like this, the very first thing I do is I think about scale. I think about the 5-foot grid, how big my minis are on that grid, and what items I'm going to use to denote scale. So here the things that really remind you of scale are a windmill, because that has a realistic height in the real world. Who knows how big a manticore is? But a windmill is something that kind of puts some scale on the scene. And also this fence, right? This fence that is meant to keep out animals from the garden of this apothecary who makes potions with the stuff from this garden in my head. So that was the first step to figuring things out. And I had to lay that out in Inkarnate. And I'm going to replay a video here of me making a similar scene to this. I kind of remade it for the purpose of this video to show you the steps. But the one thing that I didn't do in the video was redo my thinking on the scale. So the first thing you do is you lay down the grid, you bring out some minis, or you bring out some items that you think will establish the scale for the scene, and you build everything else around that. All right, let's look at the video. Create a new map. The first thing it does is ask you what scale do you want, or what map style do you want, and that'll set some of the default tokens and color choices and things that it's doing for you. For my game, I'm mostly using the Fantasy Regional HD, and I'm doing that for the towns and even the battle maps because I like playing in isometric, and this defaults to a sense that it's cartoony and isometric. If you're doing a top-down D&D game, then Fantasy Battle Mat has a lot of stuff for you with a top-down square grid, but I'm assuming an isometric grid, and I'm finding that Fantasy Regional HD is working really well for me. There's a couple of other styles down below that are maybe better for world maps, but we'll do a video on that some other day. So I'm picking 2K and digital landscape because that's about the size of a lot of my players' laptops. 2K seems appropriate to me for a virtual tabletop game. I'm not publishing or printing this map. I'm bringing it as a highly compressed JSON to Foundry VTT to put as the backdrop. I do not want this image being huge in file size, so I gotta keep the resolution reasonable. And every time you double the dimension on a map, you're actually multiplying the file size by about 4 because it's squared. So you have to be careful about just how resolution you go when you do Foundry, because otherwise you're starting to transfer some very large files to players, and they're not necessarily going to look any better or have any more detail in them because you're only going down to a 5-foot grid here, and players aren't going to be interested in the details lower down than that. So I'm going with 2K and digital landscape, which by the way is the default for Inkarnate. So that worked really well. When you start out in Foundry, you get just water. And effectively this whole thing here is the background. The first step I do when I'm making a map that involves no water is I'm gonna build up the land. So this, I'm just gonna really quickly click the sculpting tool and then make the tool very large and then build up all the ground, so that now I can paint in the foreground layer. The background layer is for the water, the foreground layer is for the dirt, the ground. Now, as you get more advanced in Inkarnate, you can start taking things that are either tokens or the foreground layer and flattening it down into the background layer. So there's some advanced lighting approaches and things that involve blending through taking stuff and pushing it into the background, basically taking a stamp and flattening it into a raster image on the background. I'm not quite doing that yet. I'm not doing any of that in this map. We're going to keep it really simple for the first map we make in Inkarnate. So I pick out my windmill and I get it to about the right scale. If I was doing this for the first time, I would probably have the grid turned on. I'll show people how to do the grid later. And then I'm going to go with the brush tool and I'm going to start painting in, I painted in the grass because that's sort of the base canvas that I want. But then I'm going to paint in using a little bit less opacity on that brush, so you can still see a little bit of that grass texture underneath it. I'm going to start painting in the path to the windmill that the players are going to approach on. So built into this map is my idea of how I'm going to run the encounter. Same thing as if I was drawing a battle mat in an in-person game. So now I'm looking for the fence, the gate. I'm looking through gates, walls. I don't really like any of those. And looking through all the kind of token sets that come with Inkarnate. It was actually the graveyard has a pretty interesting iron wrought fence. And so I just figured it's an old windmill. Who knows who you lived there before this nice apothecary. So maybe, it's kind of been adapted into a nice one. And I'm going and picking out from this set of fence work, all the pieces that I want and scaling them so they look about right for the windmill, so I don't get a weird scale disparity. And I'm doing this on a layer. I put the windmill on layer 5, and you only get about 10 layers in Inkarnate. And then I drop down to layer 4 right underneath it for this. And that's going to ensure that no matter where they are, the fences are going to receive the shadow from the windmill. Now, in really fine details, here, let me pause it. The fence disappears behind the windmill, like underneath it. It doesn't blend nicely into the side of the windmill wall. Do I care? Not really. This is meant to be a really quick D&D map, so I just keep going. If I wanted this to look perfect, I would do it in Photoshop, but I don't really care. The thing that I care about right now is fast. Then I'd start drawing in some browner dirt because the apothecary is going to have a flower garden. So I figure they've tilled the earth more. It's browner. Maybe it would get like mulch or darker, just depending on what that's like. So just to help the players understand what the ground is like, and that there's an area that's marked out as a garden. And then I'm going to go through and put in some of those flowers, or I guess I'll do the well first. So the well is an important piece of terrain because that's what the monster is going to be standing on, kind of perched over the garden scene to start with. And I'm going to put a little area of grass around the well because maybe all the water that sloshes out there helps the grass grow. And then, let me scan forward. I'm going to go and put out these flowers. And the first attempt to do that I kind of went overboard. So the nice thing about the flowers is that it has this random stamps setting. So if you look up at the top right, there's actually 3 of these big bulby purple flowers, and if the random stamps is checked, it's going to randomly pick between those 3 every time I place. So the flowers are going to change a bit, which adds a nice little bit of mixing up randomness, so they don't look sort of like mechanically placed flowers. So I place them, and then one thing I realize here is that I went way overboard on these bulb flowers. They're too similar. These don't look good. So I had to go find a way to remove them without selecting the fence. So it's a good example of going through and messing with the objects that have already been placed. So I went to here. When I start selecting stuff, on the far right side, it shows me all the objects that have been placed and a little number for which layer I put them in. So I put the windmill in layer 5, but the graveyard and the flowers are in layer 4, right underneath the windmill. So I'm going and hitting the lock button on all the graveyard fence objects so that I can't select them. And I'm doing the windmill and the well and the graveyard, all the things that I want to keep. I'm locking those. But now when I take V and the select tool, I can just delete the flowers because I can't select the things that I locked. Now I can go do the flowers again and just kind of do this as many times as I like until I've got the garden right. So I wanted a lighter, not as dense flower garden. So I'm going to mix in some other plants. I think I get some lavender bushes. I'm still going with this purple theme. It's a potion maker's garden, so I kind of want the flowers to be kind of crazy, to give the sense that there is some magic in these flowers. And I go through and I put in some lavender bushes. I think in the final version I might have mixed in one more type of plant. But now I want to build up the area around it. So here I'm taking these rocks. I'm drop down the layer that I'm editing on onto level 0. Because it's sort of like the background. I want all the foreground gaming elements to be above this. And, holding down the shift key and the scroll wheel, I can change the size of the stamps to kind of get the scale right. This windmill's backed against a mountain, so I kind of wanted it easy to approach on one side and hard to approach on the other side, but to still provide some tactical kind of things. It's a battle mat, so some tactical things for the players to deal with. So, there's enough space there to sneak around. There's things to hide behind. There's a fence that you can go and take cover behind. There's all sorts of things here that the players can use to get more invested in the scene, maybe do a little bit of storytelling. So I put some little hills to indicate that there's like higher terrain. And then I go through, and I think I do some trees next. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of choices for trees in Inkarnate. So I just kind of figure out which biome I'm in. And you can see that a lot of the trees are stamp sets. So as you click, it'll mix up the trees and make it look a lot more random. So I picked jungle. It's a rainy island. So I sort of picked, this jungle tree to place down. Let me scroll through some of this. So I placed a whole bunch of trees. And the nice thing about Inkarnate in these isometric styles is that the lower down you place a tree, the more things that are, in vertical perspective on the canvas are going to be placed behind it. So it's automatically figuring out what goes in front of what. And that makes making these really quick. In Photoshop, that would take a long time if I had two different types of things mixed in and I had to figure out the layering. So every single one of these layers has that kind of feature on. So putting all the rocks and the grass and the trees on layer 0 means Inkarnate's going to deal with what should be in the foreground and what should be in the background with regards to which one occludes or blocks the other one. I wanted a lot of high grass in this terrain, in this battle mat, because I wanted the players to be able to sneak up on things. I think in the book, it's sort of just in a big open field, and it's pretty difficult to feel like you have a chance to sneak up on anybody. It's like a windmill on top of a hill. So here I wanted a windmill in the middle of high grass next to a mountain, with a gate, lots of stuff to go sneak up on. So it's a first level party, right? They're going to get, if they directly fight this thing, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. By the way, first level Dungeons and Dragons is probably more dangerous than any other level of Dungeons and Dragons. If you play according to strictly the rules, just about any encounter has a pretty high chance of killing somebody, just because a lot of the monsters can dump out enough damage to drop a player to 0 hit points. We did have one player die in the first fight. I kind of whiffed it. I just said, nah, we're not killing a character off of a single critical hit from a big monster. We spent so much time making these characters. You're in trouble. We'll have this affect the story or something. So here I am, and what I've done is I've turned on the grid because I remembered that I forgot to do that at the beginning. So I'm just making sure that 5-foot grid still makes sense for the scale of things. If it didn't, I'd probably have to rescale some of the stuff and figure out how to fix stuff. I really recommend getting the scale part worked out first in Inkarnate, because you're going to be exporting something that you want to know the grid lines up perfectly. You don't want to start messing with the grid size afterwards, because then you're going to have to learn all new math on how to bring this into Foundry quickly. Because I kept the default Foundry grid size and type, the huge advantage I have is that I can bring this into Foundry really quickly. So you're going to see the defaults for the isometric grid, that's this diamond-shaped grid that's in here, is size 32. And whenever you export, you want to probably write down what your size settings are so that you'll remember it for next time when you find out what the matching size setting is in Foundry. So I've done this before, so I know that on these 2K maps, a grid that's isometric that has size 32 will line up perfectly with the hex grid of Foundry in size 74. How does 32 turn into 74? I have no idea. It ended up working out really well. I actually did some of the math for other types of maps and it turned out to be a different number, but for Inkarnate to Foundry, 74 works great, and I'll show that coming up. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to drop the opacity of the grid a little bit just so that it doesn't show up quite as much. You really only need it for people to understand the scale because, well, they've got the grid worked out for them in Foundry in terms of snapping to the grid. I guess I'm going to go and mess with the dirt a little bit more to make that look more like dirt. And then I hit the export button because I'm done, right? This map is looking pretty good. So I hit the export button and save it. but I export the image and I export it at 2K. I have the option to export it at higher resolution, but there's not really a reason to do that. You know, realistically, if your player's at slower internet, I might take that into a photo editor and change it to JPEG and turn the JPEG compression up really high just to, you know, to compress it more to make it a smaller file size for people. But, you know, making a folder in my folder that's through Dropbox synced over to Foundry. So I make a windmill tutorial folder and I save the file there. And then when I create a new map or new scene in Foundry, I call it windmill tutorial. And then I go into the background image and I go navigate for, you know, my Dropbox folder, tutorials. Where is it? Got a lot of tutorials now. Windmill tutorial. I can use the search to kind of find inside a single folder to find the thing I'm looking for. And then I switch here, that's the most important thing. In the grid, I switch the grid to hexagonal columns, odd, and I change the grid size to 74. I up the opacity and turn the grid red, because I'm just doing that for aligning it. And I'm gonna, just because it's an outdoor scene, I'm gonna turn on global illumination, I'm gonna turn off token vision, not really using any of the dynamic line of sight stuff in this map. So now I've got this new windmill tutorial and I've got that grid up. And I'm going to configure and align the grid with that tool. I'm just using the arrow keys because it's already the correct size, 74. I could take the bottom of the hexes and line them up with that, you know, so that they kind of sit down there on the bottom of the Inkarnate grid. Drop the opacity on the grid here and it's perfect. So I can prove that it's perfect by going and grabbing a token. So I'll just grab a handy dandy Kobold and drop it on that map, and then as I move it around, it lines up with the grid perfectly. Hope you liked that video. I'm probably going to do more videos on Inkarnate at different scales, world maps, dungeon maps, that sort of thing, and then talking through some of the techniques I used in Photoshop to do some post-production on those really quickly to get the atmosphere and all the various things that I want that aren't in Inkarnate quickly into my maps without too much muss and fuss. I'll also probably go and do some videos on, well, Patreons that I've started to follow to get more isometric assets and art assets to put into my game. Thanks everybody for following along. Subscribe, like, comment, I don't know. It's YouTube. You know what to do. Thanks.